You're listening to In the Fast Lane. This is episode number 6 of the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix. My name is Matt Clayton and I'll be your co-host as we wrap up a big Sunday of action at Silverstone at the 70th anniversary Grand Prix. And yes, that wasn't a Mercedes driver you saw standing on top of the podium, as we had a first win of 2020 for Red Bull Racing and Max Verstappen. Later on, we're going to catch up with this week's special guest, the Deputy Team Principal of the Williams Formula One team, Claire Williams. But away from F1 on two wheels, we had the Czech Republic Grand Prix. It was a weekend of damage limitation for Australia's Jack Miller, who made some late passes to sneak back into the top 10 and finished 9th after qualifying just 14th. But what a result at the front of that race. A maiden win in just his third MotoGP start for rookie South African Brad Binder on a KTM. It's the first MotoGP win for that manufacturer as well. And we had another first-time podium finisher in Franco Morbidelli in second for Yamaha, and a surprise pole sitter in Johann Zarco finishing third on a 2019 spec Ducati. It really was a very bizarre race at Brno. I unfortunately didn't have any money on a Binder Morbidelli Zarco trifecta, so I'm not shopping for luxury yachts this week, and someone else who isn't by the sound of that is Michael Lemonato. Hello, Michael.
Hello, yes, my internet connection barely has the money to be upgraded, so alas, maybe next week I'll have a go, but who could replicate such an unusual result?
Well, I had a luxury yacht in mind, but that'll have to wait for the next crazy result in either Formula One or MotoGP. But look, we had a surprise in MotoGP. We certainly had a very big one at Silverstone. If Mercedes were going to be denied a race win this year, the first few races probably taught us that it would be down to Max Verstappen and Red Bull, but we thought they'd probably blown their best chance at the British Grand Prix a week earlier. But both driver and team were flawless in that 70th anniversary Grand Prix on Sunday. Michael, how did they manage this?
Yeah, it's incredible to think we've gone from only a week ago thinking that no one could beat Mercedes at all this season to 1 week later having a race that was really decided on merit. There's not really any asterisks on Max Verstappen's win from this Grand Prix. And it really came down to, again, contrasting this week with last. Last week it was all about how bad the Pirelli tyres were. This week they really had a blinder by bringing a softer set of tyres that Mercedes couldn't quite get a handle on. No one really used them in practice, so no one was exactly how sure they were going to work in the race. And it turned out the Mercedes car just pretty much hated them. Hated the hard, hated the medium, and Max Verstappen's didn't. He absolutely nailed his strategy, was faster than the Mercedes in every phase of this race pretty much. And almost by the end of it, had to say cruise to victory. And who'd have thought we'd be saying that 5 rounds in?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, he could have won that race 2 or 3 different ways in the final stint. But I think if we know anything this year, if Mercedes has an Achilles heel, a very slight one, it seems to be very hot conditions. We know how fast that car is, but it seems to work its tyres harder than any other. In the end, we had Lewis Hamilton recover to take second place and also bag an extra point for fastest lap near the end, which left his teammate Valtteri Bottas a frustrated third after starting from pole. There were some pretty grumpy faces at Mercedes, unusually, and if anything, they seemed a little mystified by actually what had happened.
Yeah, you could really tell that this caught them by surprise. And, they had a bit of a sample of these tyres last weekend. They're a bit softer this weekend, but still 2 of the 3 were the same. But because they really didn't run them in practice, but still made some changes to try and ameliorate the explosions we saw at the end of the last race, meant that we had some unusual effects with the way that car was using its tyres. And that meant that in terms of strategy, and we especially saw this with Valtteri Bottas' second stint, they were kind of thinking on the fly, and in the back of their heads, I think they realised that Max just had too much pace, but they still tried to sort of match him. That second stop for Bottas effectively cooked his race, because when Lewis Hamilton took his second stop later, had better pace, which meant he was able to nab second off Bottas. And you could really see, this was quite a difficult weekend for Bottas. He had the pace, had more pace than Hamilton for most of this race, but could not convert that to make inroads on the championship deficit. And he went from really looking quite bouncy after getting pole ahead of Hamilton to being, you could see, really quite distraught. And you've got to wonder if, and it's a big if, Red Bull Racing is going to play a role in this championship fight, even if it's a sort of supporting role. Doesn't leave a lot of room for Bottas to make up points, does it?
No, it certainly doesn't. And I think you mentioned the key word there before, cooked. We mentioned the heat before. We're in Barcelona next Sunday for the Spanish Grand Prix in August. We're usually there in May and it's not cool then. So, looking ahead, we've probably got 30 degrees ambient all weekend in Barcelona. We know that's a circuit with really long, loaded corners. It could be another chance for Red Bull to perhaps turn the screws a little bit on Mercedes.
Look, it could be, but look, we could have a competition on this podcast about who wants to be more skeptical about how good a championship we're going to get in the sense of whether Red Bull or not can apply pressure. But I'm definitely a little bit cynical about this, because I think with Barcelona, we've got to remember a couple of things. One is the forecast at the moment is for 30 degrees. So it's not out of control. And, Silverstone, they did talk about how hot it was, but it was actually less than 30 degrees. Not by a lot, but it wasn't too far out of the ballpark. Pirelli's are going to bring its hardest tyres again. So the tyres that Mercedes looked pretty unstoppable on at the first Silverstone, up until they blew up, of course. But let's say that's not going to happen a second time. And of course, Mercedes will have learned a lot from this weekend. I don't think Mercedes has in the history, well, since they started winning in 2014, have a history of making the same mistake twice. So in terms of, look, we've got some of the ingredients that could make Red Bull racing a bit more competitive, but I still struggle to see it getting away from Mercedes even in Barcelona. Something unusual would have to happen. It'd have to be much hotter, I think, for us to get too excited here. I don't want to, be a downer, but that's my gut instinct.
Look, you could very well be right. I think that's why the past Sunday's result was such an anomalous one. But where it leaves us now is that Lewis Hamilton leads the World Championship with 107 points. Max Verstappen's now up to second on 77 points, which you compare the relative pace of those two cars. That's over the course of the season. That's a bit of a surprise. Valtteri Bottas drops to third on 73. Really is a three-way race for the top step this season. Incidentally, Verstappen's win, the first not from pole position in the past 8 races stretching back to Mexico last year. But we mentioned that top 3, 4th in the championship and 4th in the race at Silverstone was Ferrari's Charles Leclerc. He managed it on a one-stop strategy from 8th on the grid. Now, we know that car's not great. He's not winning races and starring at the front like he did last year. But to my mind, there's a real maturity and some real class about what he's doing with what he has this year, and I think justifies this long-term faith that Ferrari have put in him.
Yeah, and this was a result that was absolutely a Leclerc-driven one. Because as you say, the car is not that great. The results they've had in Silverstone, which actually been fairly good on balance, have largely been because they've ripped some downforce off that car. Interesting, actually, that by them reducing downforce in Britain a couple of weeks ago, a lot of teams followed that, and as a result, the results of the picking order changed a little bit. So Ferrari, in a sense, kind of led the way on that one. And Leclerc was actually really pushing for that one-stop strategy from the car during the race. They talked about it before the race, but he was kind of the driver on that one, ended up paying massive dividends, got ahead of Hulkenberg, and then even Albon, who was recovering fairly strongly later in the race. And that's a really good result for him to think he's up there in a car that, as you said, is not so great this season. Although maybe it's better than it looks. After all, he's got a couple of 4th places now and a podium. But really, we've got to contrast this with the guy in the other car, I think. As good as Leclerc's been, and look, I'd love your opinions on this, Matt. This relationship between Vettel and Ferrari, already knew it was looking pretty testy early in this season, but it's really gotten spicy in the last 24 hours. And I mean, can it last? We've got more than 10 races to go, and it's already getting ugly.
Getting a bit fractious. I think in any normal season, perhaps you would say not. But you look at the results of Leclerc compared to Sebastian Vettel. I think maybe Sebastian Vettel's doing what the car is capable of, and Leclerc's outdriving the car a little bit. But you look at Sebastian Vettel, poor qualifying again in 12th, spun on the first lap by himself, dropped to last. Openly critical of the team over the radio with the pit stop strategy after they pitched him back out into some traffic. It is starting to fray at the seams a little bit, and you look at how far down the championship table he is. We know that he still doesn't have a confirmed address for next year. It's a long season with this as the start to go through for that team, isn't it?
It is, and it's the public criticism, I think, and we know that Ferrari really doesn't like that kind of thing. Drivers have been sacked for it in the past, and he doubled down on it as well. It wasn't even necessarily, he was a bit angry in the car. He was talking about the poor strategy that Ferrari executed, and that certainly played a part. Vettel's spin on the first lap certainly played a part as well. But post-race, he sort of implied that, maybe they'd essentially forgotten about him in the race. In fact, I think he implied, I think it was the Dutch or German broadcaster, that they'd essentially pitted him early just to get him out of Charles Leclerc's way, really dudding his strategy from there, put him in traffic. He could do nothing in traffic because the car is fundamentally not that good compared to even some of the midfield cars. And from there, he was going to make no progress. In the end, he didn't even finish in the points, whereas at least last week he managed to get home with 1 or 2. So that kind of open criticism, never goes down so well. And yeah, with so many races still to come, some of them are going to be more difficult than this. You'd have to think, considering that car's lack of speed, Italy's coming up. There's going to be no greater pressure moment for Ferrari than that. I can see this only going further downhill, and I'm really interested to see how it's going to end.
The only saving grace for Ferrari this year with 3 races in Italy is that there'll be no fans at any of them. But anyway, we should perhaps start looking up the German word for tractor, because that's probably the next step that Sebastian Vettel is going to. But running through the back end of the points, Alex Albon was 5th for Red Bull. Certainly a better effort than the British Grand Prix, but he was still 39 seconds behind his teammate who won won the race. Racing Point locked out 6th and 7th for Lance Stroll and Nico Hülkenberg. Hülkenberg was again substituting for Sergio Perez, who had another positive COVID-19 test. We'll get back to Racing Point a little later on, Michael, but the rest of the top 10, 8th for Esteban Ocon and Renault, who was the only driver besides Leclerc to one-stop their way to the points. Lando Norris 9th for McLaren, pretty tricky weekend for that team. Meritorious drive by Danny Kvyat to finish 10th for AlphaTauri after he was knocked out in Q1. That was a good effort by him. One name conspicuous by his absence in that little list was Daniel Ricciardo, who finished 14th. Really tough Sunday for him. He had looked so good on Friday, qualified 5th, had thoughts of perhaps muscling in on the podium fight. Michael, I suspect that's a race he'd like a reset button on.
Yeah, I think so. I thought it was in equal parts a bit of a jab, but also I could understand where he was coming from when he described the spin that really undid his race as a bit of a Seb spin. Maybe a little bit unfair on Vettel, but he did spin in that race, so I guess it kind of makes sense. But he sort of said it early on, and this really speaks to how close the midfield is and how such small margins make such big differences, that race was already kind of getting away from Renault early on in the Grand Prix. Said he probably would have liked to have gone down the Ocon route had he realised how good that was going to be. And the negatives for this race really started in practice as well, where they used one of their hard tyres, which meant they didn't have that as a strategic option in the race, and the mediums ended up not holding up as well as he would have liked. So there are a couple of cascading effects for Renault not really to capitalise on this one. Still, his finishing position was compounded certainly by that spin that dropped him down the order. He probably would have been a bit more on the table for him. But yeah, it's gone from high moments for Renault to not really being able to capitalise. Not necessarily, let's say, a direct criticism of that team, because again, the midfield is so close that it's really about how well these teams are responding to things in the race that are making massive differences. And I guess as a bit of a positive for them, McLaren didn't really score heavily either. So in that sense, in the championship sense, they won't be too disappointed to come away with this one, but definitely some points left on the table.
Yeah, definitely for Renault. Now, we did warn you about this, Michael. The biggest story of the weekend, probably for a few weekends to come yet, is with Racing Point. Now, we know they've been docked 15 Constructors' Championship points and fined €400,000 after the FIA upheld Renault's protests against their brake ducts. The FIA ruling was pretty lengthy, but I won't say in 25 words or less, but get to the crux of what the situation is here, because this one's going to run and run, isn't it?
Yeah, this is going to, well, almost literally every weekend pending the appeal process, because again, those brakes were actually not even protested, but brought up by the FIA post-race, post the ruling as well, it's got to be said, and the team was reprimanded again, which people might find confusing. The crux of this is the process by which Racing Point designed its brake ducts. Brake ducts went from being able to bought from other teams last year to this year you having to make them yourself. There are certain parts you do and don't have to make yourself. And while the basis for them was the Mercedes brake ducts they bought last year, essentially the FIA found that for its rear brake duct, it didn't change them enough between this season and last season, this season, I should say, for them to be considered original. And as a result, they got fined and also lost 15 points from a race earlier in the year. But, and this is the controversial part, and this is what's going to become part of the appeal, they're allowed to continue racing the parts that have been designed illegally, which is certainly contentious, a little bit confusing as well, some might say, because while this is a breach of the sporting regulations, not the technical regulations, there have been disqualifications for sporting breaches in the past. I think of Renault in Japan last year, wasn't it, with a brake bias device on their car that was a sporting breach but earned a disqualification. So 5 teams are appealing this. Half the grid is appealing this. 4 of them for a harsher penalty, and Racing Point, believe it or not, for no penalty at all. Would you believe it? Of course, that culminated in Lawrence Stroll releasing that video before the Grand Prix. It was a little bit weird, but good on him. I'm glad he's sticking up for his own team. And this is going to rumble on for quite a while, as you said. The lawyers have gotten involved, and you know that's never going to be short when that happens.
No, I think you've summed it up quite well there. Everybody is grumpy. See you again next weekend, but that's pretty much the way it works out. But look, we'll definitely speak to Claire Williams about that shortly, given that they're one of the teams that want a tougher sanction for Racing Point. I think the other interesting thing here is if €400,000 and 15 Constructors' points is the price you have to pay for having a car at the sharp end of the field, then perhaps there's a bit of a precedent there. That's part of it. And also, I think if you're looking at some of the relationships some of these teams have further down the grid, the only reason we're talking about this is that the Racing Point is quick. For example, if Haas were taking a lot of parts of this year's Ferrari, well, we know this year's Ferrari is not particularly quick, so I don't think anyone's going to be protesting that. So certainly that story is going to run and run. But where we are now, we've had 5 races in the past 6 weekends after no racing at all. It's definitely come in a rush. We'll make it 6 in 7 weekends next Sunday when we head to the Circuit de Catalunya. just outside of Barcelona for the last leg of this latest triple header. It's a very, very intense calendar in 2020, and we rumble on next Sunday. That's for next week, but for now, it's time to catch up with this week's special guest. Joining us on this week's episode of In the Fast Lane, we've just had back-to-back races at the home of British motorsport at Silverstone, and there are a few names more intertwined with British motorsport than Williams. On the line, it's a very warm welcome to the Deputy Team Principal of the Williams Formula One team, Claire Williams. Hello, Claire.
Good morning, Matt. How are you?
Going very well, thanks. We just had a significant milestone for the sport, obviously, with this 70th anniversary GP. No more appropriate place, really, to celebrate that. But for you, take us back to your earliest memories of the place, probably trying to stay out of trouble with your dad's team when you were a kid. And then, if I remember correctly, I think your first real job after uni was there as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. You're right. Silverstone clearly plays holds a very special place in my heart. It's a really magical race. Obviously, we're missing the fans this year, and they're what make this venue so special for, I think, all of us in Formula One, but not least Williams. We've had a lot of successes here over the years. We took our first ever race win here. We celebrated our 100th Grand Prix victory, but my memories date back a long time before that. I think I was probably coming here from the age of kind of dot, really. When I was very young, my parents, it was a case of be seen and not heard. And so we were very much put to work as children, as the Williams kids, when we would come to the British Grand Prix. It was the only race really that we were taken to as kids. And so I would spend my time doing the washing up in these little kind of camper vans that were our motorhome equivalents at the time. And doing the washing up, making tea were my two jobs. And then once I'd done that, I was expected to go and get myself lost for a good few hours in the merchandise area. So I have wonderful memories of this. And obviously later on, seeing, when Nigel drove for us, seeing Nigel take his incredible victories here, and with the crowd invasions coming onto the track at the end of the race after the checkered flag. It does, as I said, hold a special place in my heart. And like you said, Matt, it was where Silverstone was my first job. I started here as a junior press officer, back in 2000, something like that. So, yeah, I have a long history here.
No doubt plenty of memories for you. I did want to go back to something a little more recently than that, and let's rewind to March in Melbourne when we last saw you, unfortunately, so very briefly. I suspect that Thursday night before things were cancelled on the Friday would make for a good chapter in a Netflix series. But for you personally, you leave Melbourne, you get on the plane home. What's going through your head at that time? There's so much uncertainty about the season, what comes next, there's all the health considerations, you're effectively in the driver's seat for a team. That must have been a pretty confusing and muddied flight back to the UK, wondering what was coming next.
Yeah, well, obviously, we my husband and I landed on the Wednesday early evening, and then we were back on a plane on the Friday night. So long way to come, but it very much felt like one of those moments in history that you'll never forget. You just remember where you were when X happened, and it felt like that. It felt quite an enormous moment, and because obviously we'd all flown out. It's Australia hosts the first Grand Prix of the year. Everyone gets incredibly excited, and we know Melbourne always welcomes us with very open arms. And you're just walking into the circuit on the first day with the fan walk and the green carpet, and it's always such a special moment because you're back doing what you love, and the fans are there, and you get the opportunity to talk to them, and they all want your autograph and to have photos. And because of the health concerns with Corona at the time, we obviously couldn't interact, so you just have to walk past, and that really kind of cemented things for me, at least. And then from there on in, it just got incredibly difficult. It was a very unusual circumstance, I think, for all of us at a decision-making level as to what would happen with the race moving forward going into the weekend. It was a very challenging time. It was unprecedented. We've never been in this kind of position where we had to make these kinds of decisions. And it's always easy to look back on hindsight and go, well, should you really have gone to Melbourne anyway, or should you have done this, or shouldn't you have done that? And I think Formula One did the best job that they possibly could under the circumstances. But like you say, it will make for a very interesting chapter in a book, because it was incredibly unusual. And obviously that flight home was strange. I left the team behind. I was one of the first people to get on a flight home. And that's very odd, leaving your team, because we didn't even know if people would make it back in, before any quarantines, for example, would be put in place. So yeah, it wasn't fun, I have to say. It was very difficult, and not knowing what the future held was incredibly difficult as well for the sport.
Fortunately, of course, Formula One did manage to resume, and once it started again, it almost hasn't really stopped. One weekend off so far, and it's taken only really 5 weeks for things to absolutely hit fever pitch, and we're already embroiled in something of a bit of a controversy, as we've seen in this weekend gone, with protests around Racing Point and appeals and the potential for appeals. I want to go a little bit more to the philosophy of this debate, though, because Williams has certainly for a long time been on the side of constructors really owning their cars and really being an independent sort of aspect of this sport. How important is this debate over however many weeks this is going to be about where Formula One goes in terms of constructors versus, I guess, something a little bit less than a constructor?
Yeah, it's quite a difficult conversation, I think, for all of us to have, because, quite honestly, nobody wants to be criticising your fellow competitors. As much as this is a sport and we're all incredibly competitive against each other and you use everything within your armoury to beat your rivals, no one ever really wants this kind of situation. But Williams has always been very clear about what we feel to be the real and true DNA of this sport, the traditional DNA. Some would argue that, well, that is traditional, that is history, and in order to be successful, you need to adapt, innovate, and change. And that's what, teams like Racing Point have done. But we will always stand by the philosophy that Formula One teams, constructors, should absolutely be designing and manufacturing the performance-related parts on their cars. And obviously, this is the question, the debate that's going on around Racing Point at the moment with their rear brake ducts. I don't want to go into a whole lot of commentary around it. I don't think that it's right. I feel that, we have submitted our intent to protest with the FIA, and it's up to the FIA. It's their jurisdiction. We, in order to analyse what's happened and in order to attribute punishments if that's appropriate, or penalties if that's appropriate, if they're found in breach of regulations. I think it's quite confusing for fans that we've got a sporting regulation that's in breach but not a technical, and so therefore these brake ducts can be continued to be put into use, but they are performance related parts. So it's something that the FIA, we very much hope and we know they will be looking into, and that they will be making the right decision moving forward.
Claire, Formula One confusing. You shocked me with that. But let's move on to something that's not particularly confusing. Your team this year certainly seems to be back in a fight last year after being off the back of the pack. Nicholas Latifi's been very impressive in his early races, but I did particularly want to talk about George Russell. From this point of view, he seems to have really grown in leaps and bounds this year. He's a regular Q2 participant now, and he's becoming someone to really watch. What have you seen in him this year with his evolution as a driver and as a leader? Because we were talking just before we came on air. He's just 22, but he carries himself like someone who's been in the sport for 10 years, and I think you've really got something there, haven't you?
We have, and if I may, just before I talk in great glorious terms about George, which I love to do, just to talk about the team's performance, because I think it's really important that it's recognised and acknowledged the step forward that this team has made. We've obviously had an incredibly difficult 2 years, but we've always said that we will turn things around. It may take us a lot longer than anyone would like, certainly a lot longer than we would have wanted, but that's the situation you find yourself in when you are at the back of the grid. To try and turn a Formula One team around isn't the work of a moment, but we made assurances and promises that we would deliver improved performance this year, and I'm so happy that we've been able to do that. Obviously, for everybody within the team that's put in so much hard work to achieve that milestone, but also for our fans. And we have the most wonderful fans around the world that always stand by us through thick and thin. I'm sure they get a lot of grief for doing so, but to be able to show to them that we've made this step forward makes me incredibly happy. But on to George. Like you say, he is an extraordinary talent in this sport. I think everybody knew that before he came in. He was so dominant in the junior Formula, and we consider ourselves incredibly lucky that we have George in our lineup. And this is his second year. It was tough for him last year having the car that we gave him, but he just kept on fighting. And I think probably it made him stronger having that experience last year, and will give him a good platform moving forward. This is a tough sport, and to have those kinds of experiences, as much as they're difficult when you're going through them, they do stand you in good stead moving forward. But now that he does have a better car and he's able to qualify well. And my God, he's really qualifying brilliantly on a Saturday. He's giving everybody a real shot in the arm during qualifying within the team, but also on Sundays to have the kind of races that we're starting to enjoy now, converting that pace in qualifying and getting some good results in the races, everything that we promised to George as well. And I think he's really thriving on this new experience that he's having in his second year with Williams. And obviously we've got him going into next year as well. So that provides us stability. We've got a great driver in George, great talent that you have total confidence when he goes out in the car that he's going to give it absolutely everything. And obviously that transpires into great results for the team. So we're thrilled with George. We couldn't be happier.
And finally, Claire, this season is to a certain extent a little bit unknown. The calendar is still being built, and we'll wait and see how that finally pans out. And we do at least have some stability between this year and next year in terms of regulations. The team's obviously taken a good step forward this year. Can you put a target on what you're looking for by the end of this season and subsequent to that? Is it about building next year or consolidation before the rules change in the following season?
Like you say, we have got this period of rule stability going forward into 2021, and that's a great outcome and following all the conversations that we had subsequent to coming back from Melbourne. The new cost cap as well is going to certainly help. It's been dialed down from 175 to 145, and that will come into play next year. So for us, it's about taking the baseline in the car that we have this year and continuing to build performance into that car. And we know that we can do that. We know that we can keep taking steps forward this year. I think every race we've shown continued improvement. We will work hard to make sure that we maintain that pace of improvement over the remaining rounds of this year, build on that over the winter, and hopefully keep taking the fight further up the midfield into 2021. And that's always going to be our target through this journey, is to keep delivering performance, keep inching our way further forwards back to where we want this team to be, and that's at the front of the grid.
No doubt, Claire. Look, there's a lot of Australian fans that are really enjoying what Williams are doing this year and hoping that the arrow continues to trend upwards for you. Personally, it's been lovely to catch up, and look, stay well, stay safe over there, and thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, and obviously we really missed coming to Melbourne this year, and we came, but we missed racing, and we can't wait to come back next year because you guys are some of the best fans that we race in front of. So we're looking forward to coming back in 2021, but thank you for having me today.
That's all for this episode of In the Fast Lane. Thanks for joining us, and a big thanks to this week's guest, Claire Williams. We'll be back next week to wrap up another big weekend of motorsport on 2 and 4 wheels, with MotoGP in Austria for the first of 2 races at the Red Bull Ring, and F1 in Barcelona for the 3rd leg of the latest triple header. And of course, we'll also be joined by another big name guest from the world of motorsport. Until then, for Michael Laminato, I'm Matt Clayton. Join us next time for another lap in the Fast Lane.